and just to welcome Nigel, a very familiar face for those of us, including, the dowsing scene and also in the literary world. Nigel, you've been a dowser for many, many moons, and you've helped us very well in the Tamar dowsers, and you teach earth energies dowsing. You're invited to talk around and about the place on this wonderful topic, and as well as writing amazing books on. Some of us are reading the Beyond the Far Horizon. You wrote about Billy Gorn and the Hamish Miller A Life Divine. So thank you for your long standing and deeply enriching work in the world of dowsing and our fellow dowsers. And thank you for sharing the linear landscape with us this evening. And Ali.
Oh, thank you very much for that.
Kindly luminous beings, guardians of this Zoom space, we're all here in love and peace, and ask you for your hospitality, blessings, love and protections for ourselves, all communications and associated technology. And so let it be.
Amen.
Thank you, Ali. Thank you, Alex. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the blessings. Right, I'm Nigel Twinn. Most of you will know me one way or another. Some of you know me very well, and some of you obviously I haven't met before. So very brief introduction to myself. I've been dowsing for about 30 years. I've been in the BSD for about 25 of those. I was part of a group that formed the Tamar Dowsers back in 2002, which is still going thanks to, and I've been a Devon Dowser for most of that time as well. I came in very much as a lay hunter. I read The Sun and the Serpent like so many of us did in those days, and it inspired me to attempt to take up dowsing. My actual introduction to dowsing was largely down to my wife, Roz. She was that one that was keen, but I was the one that picked it up first, and the rest, as they say, is history. Why I started to do this talk a couple of years ago in various versions, and the reason I gave it was that so many people seem to have very different ideas as to what a long straight line in the landscape actually was. And although it would be it's quite difficult when you're talking to people who are talking to you about something entirely different. And quite often I would say to people, well, what sort of a long straight line do you have? And they would just look at you and they say, well, it's a lay, isn't it? And sadly, both in our country and indeed other countries, people seem to dub everything with the L word, regardless of what the person on the receiving end actually thinks it might be. So what I thought I would try to do, I thought I was doing the very simplest of tasks, was to try to work out in a way that was reasonably understandable to most people that there were different types of long straight line, and all you had to do was work your way through them. But this proved to be a much more difficult task than maybe some people would have anticipated. And so as a result, I thought, well, right, I'll try and list them out and try and talk about them a little bit. And even that proved quite controversial. So it'll be interesting to see what people say at the end. And I say I've got at least two people on the talk who actually feature in the presentation. So this will be interesting, to put it mildly. Let's start away with the screen share. That's a difficult bit. So I'm now going to screen share, and I've got my thingy here. Get up. Help. I'm going to escape out of that. I think I'm all right now. I've now got
play. That's right, Nigel.
We're on. Right. Jolly good. Well, that's a difficult bit out of the way. Right. Let's start with the linear landscape. We talk about lines being in the ether, in the ground. From my point of view, as you will probably be aware, those of you that know me, I think they're actually in the information field, but that comes right at the end of the talk, so we won't start there. we'll start by saying, well, we're the Earth Energies Group and it's December 2025. Is it already? Good heavens, there we are. What happened to the last century? Let's start with the bits that we do know and are probably reasonably solid. Back in the 1920s, Alfred Watkins wrote the old straight track based on an observation that he had on the top of Herefordshire Beacon, I think in about 1925. And he was a landscape historian and somebody who was interested in geography more than anything that we would be interested in here today. But he stood on the top of the beacon and he thought he could see alignments of ancient and sacred places. He wasn't too sure what they were, but over the years he became convinced that there were straight lines of something in the landscape, and his deduction at the end of the day was that they were probably lines of something that people had once walked down. Now, Watkins was later sort of dismissed in that sense for calling them straight tracks. My personal view is that he was probably much closer to the truth than most people would have given him credit for at the time, because if you can walk across the countryside and you know whether you are to the left or the right of the direction that you are going, then you have effectively got a handrail, an invisible handrail that you can hold, and you don't have to walk straight down the line as long as you know where the line actually is in relation to yourself. So I think he was probably quite close to the mark by calling it a track. That might be controversial in itself, in which case the rest of the presentation is going to be a real laugh for you all. Anyway, a bit later on, we come up to Guy Underwood. Guy Underwood was a trustee of the British Society of Dowsers in the 1950s, and he wrote several articles for Dowsing Today. He also wrote lots of other documents, part of which ended up in the Pattern of the Past, which was only published after his death because he felt it was too controversial to put out while he was still alive. And as we know, it was put out by Dennis Wheatley, and Maria Wheatley has taken on the portfolio. But Guy Underwood was a very different sort of chap to Alfred Watkins. Watkins was very much, I say, a landscape historian. He was somebody who was a geographer rather than anything more spiritual. Underwood took a very different approach. He was very much looking at it scientifically. He was very much a physicalist, but Earth energies in those days were seen as absolute woo-woo, and he had great difficulty in persuading the British Society of Dowsers to take him very seriously, even though he was one of their trustees. Underwood's view is important because he not only looked at the alignments, but he sought to work out the structure of those alignments. And he looked at different types of what we would call today Earth energies, and he looked how each one had a different signature, a different type, a different style. And as we know, our friend Rory Duff has taken this to a much deeper level in recent times. But Underwood was the first person, I think, on record to start to look at the structure of a long straight line in the landscape. So you've moved from geography deep into, well, science of a sort. A little bit later, we're talking here about the 1960s, early 1970s, we have John Michell coming along. Now, John Michell's view is very different. Michell was very much a visionary, as he keeps being called. He was certainly somebody who looked at the more invisible sense, the more spiritual sense of long straight lines. And the story goes, as Hamish Miller once told me, that John Michell sat on the top of Glastonbury Tor, and he felt he could see, in inverted commas, a straight line going from the Tor down to St Michael's Mount in Cornwall. And he wrote to various people about this. And when Hamish Miller and Paul Broadhurst were starting to look at the sort of dowsing that Hamish was getting into, they came up with the idea about looking for this line that John Michell had found or had discovered, and so they set off, as we know. Hamish Miller was somebody who would always tell me that he was just an ordinary bloke. And in many ways he was. And that's what made him really interesting, because he was an ordinary bloke that had a remarkable sense of discovery. And when he started looking for John Michell's line from the St Michael's Mount, as many of you will know who've read either Hamish's book or this book, that they were looking for a straight line. The first thing he found was anything but a straight line, and it wandered about all over the place. And he and Paul had a disagreement, I think, well, one could put it politely, because because Paul thought Hamish was the top-rate dowser, which he indeed was, and of course he was not finding the thing that they were looking for. But nonetheless, they persevered, and as we know, they later found something which they later called the Michael line, and that they followed it all the way up to, I think, Avebury, when they realised they'd got another line on their hands, and they went back to the start and looked for the Michael line. But nonetheless, that straight line that John Michell that had set them going, nonetheless, appears on their own chart, and you've all seen this. Well, most of you will have seen this chart before, showing what we call the St Michael Lay, going from Carnley Bowl on the far west of Cornwall up to Hopton on the east coast of Norfolk. And in a sense, the alignment has become somewhat secondary to the excitement and the interest of the whole Michael Mary complex. But nonetheless, it was what set it off, and it shows that there are these things that exist. It's on the May Day sunrise, it shines down the line, and we can talk about that a bit later. I would just mention in passing while we're here, because it comes up again in a minute, that there are all sorts of nodes on the line, some of which are on the St Michael Lay, and some are, well, quite close to the St Michael Lay. And we have to be aware that a dead straight line is not always quite what it seems. Life is never that simple. After Hamish and Paul did their work, then Gary Biltcliffe and Caroline Hoare did something similar, going from the Isle of Wight to the north of Scotland. Gary and Caroline are still very much on the same aspect, in that they are finding other alignments, going to Lindisfarne to Iona and others. But Gary and Caroline take a slightly different approach again, in that Hamish and Paul were very much looking at the places that the line went through, but the line was the important thing. Whereas here, Gary and Caroline really bring the places that the line goes through to life. They're very much social line followers, if that's the right phrase. They're interested in the social and physiological aspects of the line, which is a different aspect. So we've had, the historian, we have the physicalist, we have somebody who's taking it to a spiritual level, we've got somebody who's following it almost geographically, and we've got people who are looking at the actual sociological aspect of the line. So what seemed to be a simple lay has become a very complex feature in the landscape. The bloke on the right is a gnome-like character, is an earlier version of me. The bloke on the left is the person who first taught me to dowse, who's Alan Neil. Alan Neil was the founder of the Tamar Dowsers, and he's the guy who I've always referred to as my mentor when I get stuck. Alan wrote Ley Lines of the Southwest, which I think is probably available on eBay, if nowhere else. But Alan came from a very different situation to myself. I was, if you like, standing on the platform that Hamish had already built for people like me, whereas Alan didn't have that. He was somebody who had dowsing in his family, but it was very much water divining, and he only came into the idea of earth energies much later on. So when I met Alan, he wasn't somebody who had necessarily lent on other people to any great extent. He'd been taught to dowse, and doubtless he'd been helped along the way by various people. But when it came to lathes, or when it came to straight lines, perhaps, he never saw them as energy lines because that wasn't really his common currency at the time. He actually saw them as straight lines that you put down yourself. Now, this was a very radical difference to the sort of stuff I was reading. But nonetheless, Alan was my tutor, and you don't tend to sort of question your own tutor too much. And so when I went out looking for inverted commas lays, I was finding these long straight lines in the landscape. And then the earth energy bit was a bit, well, that was something that other people talked about. But Alan showed us how you could put down a line. He actually put it down using a mirror and broadcasting the sun's rays on a mirror across a field. And we went off and we found this line, and I thought, oh, that's very impressive. And that was his view at that time of how possibly people had done it in the past. And if we think about the line being on the May Day sunrise, maybe Alan had something there that he went even closer to the mark than we had realized. But later on, it became fairly apparent that you could put down a line with or without a mirror. And in fact, as many of you know, there's a playground of a school in Tavistock where in the town where I live now, where we had a meeting, and Alan asked us to have a look for a straight line in the playground. And of course, there wasn't one. He'd already checked that. And then he said, right, off you go for a few minutes. We went off and had a cup of tea, and we came back, and he said, okay, now look, see if there are any straight lines in this playground. And sure enough, we found a line, and it was a pretty accurate line for a load of complete novices. And we realized that what he'd done is he'd thought it into place, and he'd put it there. The reason it sticks in my mind so clearly is the fact that nobody actually thought about taking it away again. So even if you go down, if I went a few hundred yards down the road from where I'm speaking now, I would still find that line there because he didn't take it away. But that's an interesting aspect in itself. But it did mean that right up until after the time that I joined the BSD, I still thought lays were purely lines of thought, lines of consciousness, as we might say today. And maybe they are. Maybe that's what it's all about. However, Graham, hello. Uh, 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 in about 2004, I think I'm right in saying, I met this guy, Graham Gardner, who appears on this talk and is a former president of the British Society of Dowsers. It was an Earth Energies Group tour of Brittany, and although it had been well advertised, there were only about 5 of us, and Graham and I and Elspeth were 3 of them, so it wasn't a huge raging success. But what it was an incredible introduction, especially for me, to be taken round a lot of interesting sites and been given a completely different approach. Now, Graham stood on a very different platform to what Alan had done. And Graham's view, and he can criticise me afterwards if he wants, was very much that lays were all contained earth energy. They were earth energy lines that happened or were caused to be straight. So the first couple of days was quite interesting because Graham was looking for the straight energy lines and that sort of thing. He's finding them, and I'm looking for the lines of consciousness. I'm finding those, and we had a discussion about what each was finding. But by the end of the week, I think we'd both come to an understanding that there was more than one sort of long straight line, and I found that again it was completely inspiring to me because what I thought was quite an interesting topic had suddenly become a complete portfolio of ideas, and I went on from there to find other things. This is where you can find lots of long straight lines. This is the tallest standing stone in Europe. There are 1 or 2 in Austria that are probably actually bigger, but they're tilting, so they're not quite so tall. This is the menhir at Caerloas. And if anybody knows my wife Roz, she's about 5'6" tall with her hair up. And so you can imagine just how tall and massive that stone is. It's the sort of place where you can get long straight lines in abundance from all sorts of different ways and in all sorts of different contexts. But what we then have is the intervention of this chap, Billy Gorn, whose book, The Old Beyond the Far Horizon, has already been mentioned on this call. This picture was taken by my friend Thierry Souter not too long ago. Billy's still very much with us, and although he's not in the best of health, his mind is still operating extremely well. Every now and then I get an email to say, I found this article, you'll find it really interesting. Working with Billy was very interesting. In that when I worked with Hamish liked what I wrote. Well, he asked me to do the book, so that was quite a different approach. And the book, and I would just sort of send him sort of various drafts, and they'd come back with one or two tweaks. When I did Billy's, even though I'd sort of taken it all down on a dictaphone, it came back completely covered in red ink, and so we had to have 2 or 3 goes at that. Billy has a very straightforward view of life, and I think that's admirable in many ways. But he also has a very different view, and I've been very helped. I've been helped to a great deal in my researches by people who've come at things from very different angles. So just as Graham and I came to layers at a different angle, Billy has a very different view on, well, more or less everything, really. But he always backs it up with his own work and his own deductions, if you like. When it came to lays, Billy took the same view that Isaac Newton did of a lot of things. And the fact is that if you get energy, if you get 2 large masses together, they will set up a line of attraction. Now, nobody in the scientific world has ever found this line of attraction, but Newton was quite comfortable that it was there, and that was part of his legacy, which was never really developed or built into subsequent science. Billy's view is that everything attracts everything else, and that there are straight lines of something which connect those various aspects. And he'll do you a very good a demonstration on his patio with 3 watering cans, and he will show you that there's a line between this one, that one, and the other one, which will form a triangle. The closer you get them into direct alignment, the stronger they get, and the stronger they get, and the stronger they get. And eventually, if you put them into an absolutely direct straight line, it shatters and you don't get anything at all. It just disappears. Now, as some of you will know, I've done a lot of work at eclipses over the years, and where you get the sun, the moon, and the earth all in the dead straight line. And surely right at the very end, when the 3 are directly in alignment, the whole thing, well, I would have said it disappears, but Billy's a visual dowser, and he would tell you it shatters, and you can see where the line has gone, and it's lying in bits all over the place. So he has a very different view of the lay. Billy isn't the sort of person you argue with. He has his own view. You can disagree, but you're not going to get anywhere. So he's somebody who I would always consider to have a perfectly valid, if different, view of something like a lay. So we've got a very different approach again there. He's a wonderful man, and he's very humble, but there's nothing indistinct about Billy. You know where you stand. Billy also came up with a series of grid lines. We'll come back to the more common grid lines in a minute, but I'll mention this while we're talking about Billy. Billy's found, it was seen, in fact, from using his own visual dowsing, that there are grid lines which are probably an interference pattern, I think we might say, between the Earth and various other celestial bodies. I've called them interplanetary here, but obviously we got the sun and the moon in there, so we ought to call them celestial grid lines, so that if you were to go out now and into your garden, you would quite likely find part of an interference pattern between the Earth and at least one of these other bodies. Now, I have to say we were at an EEG meeting in the Kennet Valley in Wiltshire, and we were listening to Billy's talk, and he'd mentioned this, and I was sat next to a very experienced dowser, and I said to him, "What do you think about this?" And he pulled a face, and I thought, well, okay, but Billy isn't somebody you disagree with. So we went out onto outside the room, and Billy asked us to go and find one of these interplanetary grids in the field in front of us. And I have to say, I was mildly skeptical about what the outcome of this. But the two of us, this more experienced dowser and myself, walked across the field with our rods, as you do. And sure enough, we hit the Jupiter line, 10 paces away, and we looked at one another and thought, okay. Billy has an unerring ability to be right, and therefore when he says something, he's always worth listening to, even if you don't understand it. Listen to what he's saying. Quite apart from the grid lines that you've got there, in recent times, I've found that there is also a similar grid line relating to the asteroid belt, which of course we believe is a broken up planet. And only very recently, my wife Ros was trying to interpret a place that we couldn't really get our hands on. And her view was, I can only see stars here. And I thought, oh, right. And sure enough, when I asked, is this a stellar line? I got a straight yes. So, and I haven't worked that out yet, but it could well be that that's some sort of interference pattern between the Earth and the stars. There we go. Things keep evolving. Now, how many of you know that? Who that is? Anyway, I'll put you out of your misery. That's Ernst, Mr. Benker, a discoverer of the Benker grid. Back in the late 1920s, he was a German doctor. He found that there was a set of grid lines, straight grid lines going across the surface of the Earth that were that were a bit similar to the Mercator lines you see on the Mercator projection latitude and longitude lines, but at a much smaller scale. The Hartmann lines have been discussed recently in Dowsing Today by Graham Gardner, so he may well chip in at the end with his own findings. But there are people who say the Hartmann grid lines don't exist. There are those who say they're so important that you really need to avoid the crossing points, or you need to stand on the crossing points. I was at a BSD course in Leek in Staffordshire, where our friend Steve Dawson of the East of England dowsing groups said all churches that are pre-Reformation were built on Hartmann grid lines. And I thought that was an overstatement, and therefore I went down to our local church here in Tavistock to show that this was completely wrong, only to find that it was completely right. In that particular case, our local church is built on Hartmann grid lines, and I've been to all sorts of other places that verify that. Quite apart from Mr. Hartmann, we have Mr. Curry, who found something a couple of years later that was at 45 degrees to the Hartmann grid line. And there are other people. I'll come back to the Benker lines in a minute, because that's really important. The picture that they always show is the linear is the Hartmann grid lines, showing that every third grid line is a doubling up, a stronger line. Some of them are positive, some of them are negative. I don't personally find them to be particularly beneficial or detrimental, but clearly other people do. And clearly the masons of the Middle Ages found them sufficiently interesting to incorporate them in their architecture. So I won't dwell too much on that, but quite often when people are finding long straight lines in the landscape, it is some of these grid lines that they're coming across. I mentioned Mr. Benker. Now, Ernst Benker was an Austrian who in 1953, so this was after my birth, no, 1953, came up with something that was a bit like the Hartmann grid, except that it was in 3 dimensions. It was a much bigger spread, much bigger scale, and much stronger. And I've been surprised over the years that Hartmann has gained so much traction, and Benker has been, well, I'll say overlooked. It hasn't even really been investigated. But many of the more significant sacred sites that I've been to seem to have Benker grids built into them, and almost the older the site, the more likely you are to get a Benker grid line. So I'll come back to Benker in a second because you'll understand a bit more about it. This is the Merivale Menhir. Merivale is an archaeological site which is about 6 or 7 miles from our house. Indeed, if it wasn't for the fence there, you could probably see our house more or less. And I go there a great deal. So whenever somebody comes up with an idea that I haven't tested in person, I go up to my friend at the Merivale Menhir and we work it out between us. Now, you will have seen on the last slide that it's shown as a cubic box matrix. But here, the Benker grid actually encompasses the actual stone. And I'll show you a little bit more about that in a second. What it does mean is that this stone has a degree of protection, and it is part of a very large complex of stonework, most of which has been removed by stonemasons over the years. And this one, which is a nicely shaped, ready-made piece of architectural stoneware, has survived at least this far. And I reckon it's partly because it's protected by the Benker box. Now, at a BSD conference in Leicester a few years ago, well, a couple of decades ago, I suppose, we had a gentleman from Scotland. He's actually German, and he was there selling some really expensive equipment to dampen down the detrimental effect of Benker lines in your house. And so when I got to looking at the Merivale Menhir and finding that it was actually inside a Benker box, I suddenly realized that, okay, these lines may be detrimental if you're using them in the wrong way, but they can actually be extremely protective. And I think that's the real answer. So don't buy the expensive equipment, just get in the right place. The Merivale Menhir stands out on its own, a bit like the menhir in Curloas that you saw earlier. It obviously doesn't have that sort of scale. It's about 13, 15 foot high, something like that. But at the Merivale Menhir, I first started to look at the difference between the energy lays and the lines of consciousness. And I hope you can all see on there, you've got the red lines, which are the energy lays, and the blue lines, which are the lines of consciousness. The fact that that one of them goes to a TV mast, you have to sort of take with a pinch of salt, because actually that's built on the top of a tor. But nonetheless, looking around, you'll see that by and large, the red lines go to other tors, whereas the lines of consciousness go to other things, including up on the upper right-hand side there, a missing menhir, which is believed by our archaeologists to be just a robbed out kist or grave. In fact, I reckon it's the socket of a very large missing menhir, and that's why you've got that actual line in place. So you've got at that site two of the sorts of long straight lines. We then get to the bit with the banker line. As you can see, the Hartmann and Curry grids clearly exist. They're all over the world, so they're but they don't have much to say about the actual positioning of the Merivale Menhir, whereas the banker line takes it in directly. And to me, that I found that hugely significant, and I've been looking for banker lines ever since, because I think they speak to a particular heritage of our culture. They may have gone out of fashion after a while, but for a long time they were regarded as very significant protective barriers. If we look at Billy Gordon's celestial grid lines, we have the crossing of the lunar and Jupiter lines right over the top of it. As you can see, there are bits of the grids lying around all over the place, but it is quite unusual to get crossing points exactly on a menhir. It's not the top of the menhir isn't that big, but this is right on top of it. And put it together with some of the other lines that we're seeing, and it starts to become a very important place indeed. So if we put the three together, I couldn't put them all on one slide, otherwise it would just be a mess. So you can see how that particular place is an absolute nest of long, straight and significant lines. I'm sure other people will come up with places that are just as important and probably even more complicated. But considering this is only a few miles from our house, I thought that was absolutely marvellous. And I encourage you to go and look at your local standing stones in another light after this. Just down the hillside from the Merivale Menhir is a whole little village of hut circles. This is the largest one, which is believed to be, the chief's hut. I don't think it's the chief's hut at all. I think it's actually where they met up and had their ceremonies. And you can see the energy lines of consciousness. They go around there, but yeah, you get them everywhere. So that doesn't look very convincing, does it? And then we look at the solar and the celestial grid lines. Yes, there is a crossing point there. Solar Saturn is that significant? I don't know. It's not in the middle. The one happens to go through an outlying. Well, they both go through outlying stones, but I didn't think there was that too much to see in that. But when you put the banker line in, whop, straight in the middle, and almost covering the whole of the hut circle, and and my dowsing says that they knew perfectly what they were doing, and they sighted their major hut circle right in the middle of the banker line, giving themselves a banker box. And you have to look at it with a different sort of mindset, but once you adopt that mindset, well, lots of things start to fall into place. This is Merivale Quarry. I've got my back here to the stone circle up the hill behind me. It's a nasty big gash in the side of an otherwise previously quite attractive piece of Dartmoor, and it was still operational. You can still see the few buildings there. When we first moved to Dartmoor about 30 years ago, it's now no longer functional, but the gash in the hillside is still there, and it's likely to remain there ad infinitum. Further up, almost directly behind where I was previously standing, we have Fogintor Quarry, which is even bigger. And actually, you can see how much stone has been taken out of there. And it really, if the other side was a gash, this is a momentous hole in the countryside. And if you look at those two items together, on the top there you see the Merivale Quarry, at the bottom the Fogintor Quarry, and between them is a line a long straight line in the landscape, which I first came across when I was at the Stone Rose with Alan Neal, and Alan was actually showing it, demonstrating it as a line of detrimental energy, something you wouldn't want to be sleeping on. Okay, you could walk across it without too much trouble, but you wouldn't want to be sleeping on it. And he and I and various other people have done our level best to try to minimize, to balance or sort of moderate the unpleasant output from that line, which I believe is something to do with the two quarries. But But although several people in their own ways have had a go at it and have managed to dampen it down to the extent that it's difficult to find immediately afterwards, when you go back a fortnight later, it's straight back where it was. And that applies to some very experienced dowsers. And it's certainly several goes by me, but it doesn't disappear. Once you've got it, if you filled in the quarries, you might sort of dampen it down, but maybe not even then. I don't know. But nonetheless, when you cross the red line there, which are the stone rows of Merivale, you will find that, and it's actually quite a good demonstration piece. Apart from sort of the odd sheep and walkers and that sort of thing, nobody's ever going to be come to any harm from it. But nonetheless, you will find lines like this in much more urban areas and much more densely farmed areas, and I'm sure it doesn't do anybody any good. It's another type of long straight line. Now we come on to something a little more modern. This is the Wessex Astrum. Peter Knight and Sue Knight did a lot of work in Wiltshire, the Wiltshire area. They lived in Calne, which is more or less in the middle of that, just to the right in the middle. They were out looking at lines of various sorts, and Peter came up with this after a lot of research among looking at the high points around where they were living, as a six-pointed star, double pyramid, if you like. And his view was that this was something that wasn't a lay, it wasn't an energy line at all. It seemed to be just a picture in the ether, in the landscape. He went on, I think, to feel that that was part of a pattern, that there was a honeycomb of these things that stretched across the landscape. And I don't think I'm right. I think I'm right in saying I don't think he ever found out what they were, although clearly they were fascinating in themselves. But he wasn't the only one on this hop, because Chris Street did something very similar in London. I think Chris Street is the only person who've done any sort of real landscape dowsing in London, so he's in enormous credit for what he's done. But he found a big, what we might call an Earth star, right. I think it's centered on St Paul's Cathedral. It's certainly right in the urban area of London, and he was on the same hop as Peter, just coming from a different angle in a different place. And at this point, we bring in Maeve, because the whole issue of pictures in the landscape has been brought suddenly into a much sharper and more important focus by Maeve Calvert, who does all her dowsing, most of her dowsing, in the Sherwood Forest, and she found this remarkable Earth star in the eastern Midlands of England. And as you can see, it rejoins a lot of significant places, and as Maeve would tell you in much better than I can, it goes on beyond the bound of the star, and it picks up a lot of other significant places in different parts of the country, and indeed in different countries. And before we had the chance to sort of digest this, Maeve then showed that not only was it in that part of the country, but it's in different parts of the country, and all sorts of important locations are joined by these geometrical symbols. Again, we're not totally sure what they are. We're certainly not sure, unless Maeve has found out in the meantime. We're not sure who put them there, why they're there. Are they natural features? Is it something that just develops from the interaction of the human being with his or her landscape? I don't know, but it's it certainly brought the whole issue of long straight lines into a very different world. It's brought it forward. It's not sort of stuck in academia. It's not even stuck with beardy old blokes who are wandering about trying to prove that the earth under their feet is more important than anybody else's. It's something that relates to the nature and of the countryside itself and to the people who live there, and it from there on we could take it to almost to infinity. There are pictures of all sorts. This is the Merry Maidens in West Cornwall, but I could show you any sort of area where many of these lines, these features, these pictures can be found and detected by relatively novice dowsers. It helps if you have the experience to tease out one from another, but nonetheless, anybody can find this stuff, and I would encourage you to go out and just ask the question. There are other sort of long straight lines in the landscape. Of course, we have spirit lines. Sigurd Lonergan talks a lot about spirit lines, which may or may not have something to do with the landscape, or maybe they're purely informational. And Sigurd gave us a long talk about the ways of the dead, the Dedenwegen, as they appear in Holland. So we're not the only ones with unusual long straight lines. So we've got the ley alignments, we've got the lines of consciousness, Billy's interplanetary grids, we've got the landscape patterns of everybody from Peter Knight to, up to Maeve. We've got the planetary grids that Billy Gorn brought to us. We've got the lines for traction that Isaac Newton talked about. How about how many of these have had human involvement? Well, I think we could probably talk the night away on just that first question alone, really. Clearly, the human beings certainly have some input to it. Would they exist if we weren't here? It's a good question, and we're deep into philosophical territory, but nonetheless we're dealing with real stuff that ordinary people can pick up without too much practice. Do they contain earth energy? Well, you know, some of them do, some of them don't. Some people will say that if it's not earth, that all of the lines are earth energy lines of some sort. But others would say, well, earth energy, what's that? Does it have an impact on the biosphere? Well, I would say certainly does. There are certainly places in the world, and certainly long straight lines in the world, which have a very direct impact on human beings, on animals, on plants, probably on microbes and all sorts of other parts of the biosphere. So I don't think there's much doubt about that. Is it better benevolent or detrimental? Well, it's a bit of both. Not always are things that are benevolent to humans benevolent to everything else. Equally, they're not all detrimental either. It depends who you are, what sort of a being you are, and where you are, and often it depends on your own approach to it as well. It's a lot more complex than it might appear at first sight. There are a lot of people that like to move these lines about or claim to. I don't actually believe they move anything at all. I think they're moving the dowsable effect of it, but you know, that's another load of tomatoes coming my way. But certainly people will claim to be able to move lines, or to at least to be able to move the dowsable impact of the line. I'm always very dubious about moving lines of any sort under any circumstance, purely because it's all connected together in a matrix. And if you start moving the matrix about because you think you know best, I think that's very dangerous. So I think it's always better to avoid things rather than move them around. But again, there'll be people who would disagree with that. Do we understand this stuff? Well, clearly we don't. We understand a certain amount about it, and I think the more that I've sort of worked on it over the years, the less I've understood. Let's be true. Let's be perfectly honest. I've always said about dowsing that it's a bit like being locked in a room. Eventually, after a huge amount of effort, you manage to undo the lock and you get out into the corridor and you find you're in a corridor full of locked doors. And so it's I don't think we understand it entirely. I do think we're on in a direction of travel which will allow us to understand ourselves more, and that the whole idea of the long straight lines is something that enables us to understand our interaction with the world around us in a sort of semi-physical way, which sort of appeals to humans. So are all these linear features different? Well, certainly you'll get Hartmann lines corresponding to lays, but by and large, they don't sort of interact too much. Some do appear to overlay one another, but that might only be in time and space. And of course, once we're outside of this particular existence, then time and space doesn't have much, isn't so important anyway. Do we all find the same features? Well, I don't think we do, but we can find the same things that other people find if they ask us to find it. And certainly as a result of tonight, people will go out and find some of Billy's lines and maybe some of anybody else's lines, but they might not have come up with them without a bit of a prompt. My personal view is that the information field is enormously large, infinitely large to all intents and purposes. And whilst we don't exactly make it up, I do think we individually choose what aspects of that information field we want to look at any given time. And once you've observed it and felt it and got to know it, then clearly you can't unknow it. It's something that sort of accumulates. And I do think that that we are choosing to find what we find, and that's I say it's too controversial to dwell on almost, isn't it? I think we do have incoming information in all sorts of different forms. We perceive it using our gross senses and also our intuition, but we interpret all of that. There's no such thing as information that we can conceive of that we can't interpret. So we interpret it into something that's meaningful to us. But it does get a bit lost in translation when we come to talk to other people about it, which causes an awful lot of confusion. But at the end of the day, we can achieve a degree of reconciliation, providing we all understand that we're trying to understand the world around us in a way that makes sense, not just to ourselves, but to us with a common heritage. I've been Nigel Twinn. You've been a lovely audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nigel. What a wonderful journey you've taken us on, and a real thought-provoking journey as well, with lots of history, lots of context, and evidence and different perspectives and how they all weave together. So thank you very much indeed. Really lovely. And I would like to invite people to ask any questions, share any comments or feedback or anything at all. And anyone raising their hand? Mr. Gardner, thank you.
May I be the first to jump in, Nigel? Love it to hear you speak on such subjects. We're both very attached to these ideas, I know. I just want to jump in, actually, about a couple of points. Let's just stick with the first one at the moment. The Hartmann grid and the concept of churches being built to coincide with the Hartmann grid. I've certainly been in a few pre-Reformation churches where the Hartmann grid is deliberately excluded from the space. I don't know if you've come across that or not. Certainly the one I talk about in one of my books is the St. Serph's Church in Dunning, where I find there is a sort of bunch of grid lines at the door, and then there's nothing inside the older part of the church, but it's a T-shaped church with the bar of the T, the vertical bar of the T, if you like, built after the Reformation. And as you're walking down that, the Hartmann grid lines suddenly come back as you're halfway down this extension. And again, you get this bunched up bunch of lines, and then it reverts to normal. So I don't know what's going on there, but it does seem to have been deliberately excluded from the space for some reason. Just wonder if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, no, I've not come across, I haven't come across it myself. I'm delighted to hear you talk about it, and it's something I'll look out for. I suppose if I was going to be the professional dowser, I'd douse for a church which had this particular phenomenon, but I may or may not get around to that. But Graham, that's very helpful. Yes, you had another point?
I did. I'm not that familiar with dowsing the Benker grid. I do think the received wisdom that I've sort of acquired in that is that it coincides with the Hartmann grid. It kind of overlays the Hartmann grid. But that didn't seem to be the case in your the images you were using there.
In fact, I think I'm right on the Merivale Mania that it probably does, but the two aren't. For them to be overlaid, they would have to have a similar geometrical scale, and I don't think that's the case. I think there are occasions when the two do overlay one another, whether that's been taken on board by builders of sacred sites deliberately or not, I don't know. But certainly you can find plenty of cases where the Hartmann and Benker grids are in different places. And so all I would say to you, and I'm delighted to have you on the call, is please go out and look at the Benker grid, because up to me, it's so much more significant in terms of its potential to impact on the biosphere, that I feel it deserves more attention, quite frankly. So there you go.
I shall look into it more in future. Do you think the Hartmann and the Curry grids are also three-dimensional?
If you ask me straight out, I would say yes. I personally have never attempted to take them on board three-dimensionally. I suppose that the first guy to mention the Benker grid to me did say this is a three-dimensional grid, implying that that was what made, was part of what made it different. And certainly when I look at the standing stones and sometimes other vertical or sort of elevated sacred sites, then I do find that the Benker grid often has that sort of three-dimensional approach, which makes it more significant than if it was just a two-dimensional one.
Yeah, it's obviously hard for us to discern this because we're just dowsing in a flat plane most of the time, unless you're up and down ladders and stuff. But I know that the Benker is often described as the cubical grid, but it's always puzzled me why the other two aren't regarded as three-dimensional.
No, it's a fair point. It's a fair point.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Anyway, great talk, Nigel. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Graham. Over to you, Ali.
Hi, Nigel. It was a super talk. Thank you. I've got several questions. Just on the theme of grid lines on the axis of churches. I started out, as you know, with Guy Underwood, and Dennis Wheatley, from studying him, said that the axis of churches, there'll always be some sort of geodetic line. Actually, he said 12 hairlines running up the aisle, and sure enough, that's what I found. Then I heard John Moss say that there'll always be a lay running up the aisle of a pre-Reformation church, and sure enough, there was. And then Steve Dawson said that there'll always be a Hartmann running up the aisle of the church. And the church I looked for, yes, there was as well, and all three were there. So I'm curious about what you said about the overlay, and Graham, and I like what you said about it's only us that have got the hang up of time and space, and they might not, it may not be that they're all overlaying each other in the way they work. So thank you for that. I just wonder, we can have other questions, but if the questions dry up, I'm wondering, from all your decades of dowsing, whether you've noticed anything new with all the new incoming energies. I think you actually alluded to it with the incoming information, whether you're finding things are stranger now or there's unusual things that you haven't come across before, or what you thought you might find wasn't like it anymore?
Well, the whole sphere seems to be expanding and becoming more. Now, one has to say that, I'm not that old. Well, I'm not in terms of the planet. But even in the time that I've been dowsing, lots of, we'll call them new, rediscovered, I suppose we should say, aspects of informational entities are being discovered. And once it's in the public domain, then it's there for anybody else to find.
Mm.
And once it's in the public domain, then it becomes something that's part of the platform, part of the bedrock that other people can then find and build on or carry on from their investigations. And so when I started dowsing, when I'm almost contemporary with Graham, then there was informational. There was certainly a lot of Earth energy dowsing starting to be done around that time. But since then, there has been so much work done by so many people, and the more modern stuff done by Peter Knight and Maeve and others, which has enlarged it. And so you put that into the mix as well. I'm sure if Guy Underwood was around today, he would be fascinated by a lot of the stuff that we're talking about tonight. And he would be going out and sort of looking at it in his own way. But that wasn't available to him at the time, as far as I know.
Yeah, that's a really good answer, Nigel. Thank you. Yeah, other people are finding new things as well. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Ellie. Mark, you've got a question for Nigel.
Oh yes, hi, thank you. Great talk. Um, I found a blog and that had a winter solstice alignment with the node of the Athena and the Apollo. But I was just wondering the significance of a solstice alignment or lay, and because the sun's moving. So, but would that be more so on the actual day, or I was just opening up your thoughts on it, really, Nigel.
I'd talk about I'd probably talk about that all day, but in fact, I would suggest that the actual solstice itself isn't that significant. Lots more stuff being thrown at me, but it's part of a series. A day either side of it probably wouldn't make a lot of difference. But nonetheless, the fact that the alignment exists at all means that people like you and I can go out and find it, and we then sort of attach our own importance to it, and it means something to us.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I think if you look at
Do you think that's the frequency of each individual that sort of dowses slightly to their perception, or do you think it's a frequency thing, or?
I would tend to push it away from the physical frequencies and that sort of thing, and say that it's actually more to do with the way in which we approach it. After all, everybody on this call could go up to the Merrymouth Menhir tomorrow and find something different, quite frankly.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that any of us are wrong. It just means that we're looking for something different, or we're open to something different. And I think so often we think of ourselves discovering stuff deliberately from one end. The other end of the channel is always open, and it's just a matter of opening the channel between us. And therefore things like solstice lines are quite possibly, they're there to be found. Whether they mean anything to us, I don't know, but certainly where you've got ancient and sacred sites that incorporate lines like that, then you have to say somebody somewhere already knew this stuff, and that they took it on board. Whether they left enough of it around, enough of that sort of thought pattern around for us to pick it up, is another matter. But we're doing it somehow.
Yeah, like this is similar to the Boscawen method because that's an old Celtic, goes way back, and that's centre standpoints to the summerised summer solstice as
I
well.
think anything like that probably is there to be found and has been found previously, especially if it's got stones on it. But maybe there's been a long gap during which time nobody's regarded it as significant. And yeah, this stuff does die away into the background, but it's always there to be found by anybody that's got a mind to look for it.
Lovely. Thank you, Nigel.
Thank you. And good evening, Ken. You have a question.
Yes, I'll think of one. That was a really excellent talk, Nigel. I beautifully presented. Very much enjoyed it. I don't think you challenged anybody with anything too. I don't think you annoyed anybody by some of your statements. I think they were all very, very fair. My question would be, I myself don't have too much to do with all of these lines. I tend to study other things in these ancient sites, but these lines all seem to be associated very much with ancient and sacred sites. And we're very much blessed with them in the UK. We've got lots of ancient sites. Other countries and some parts of the UK are not blessed with these ancient sites. I was in Cornwall, where we had a week's holiday in Cornwall, 2 major storms. It was great. But there are some countries in the world where there don't seem to be so many of these ancient sites. I'm going to ask you a question that probably hasn't got an answer, but I would like your opinion. Do you think the people who built these sites have anything in common? Do you think they had a common reason for building the sites? Do you think they had an awareness of the energy that was around these sites? And if so, who do you think they were?
Yeah, well,
why did they build the sites?
oh, well, straightforward question then. Right, okay. I think to some extent you've answered your own question there, because you were saying about having a common awareness of it, and I think partly it's the countries that have a longer standing human tradition. Possibly, I've never doused in Syria and Iraq for fairly obvious reasons, but I'm sure if you went to places which are more New World, we've got Susan on the call here somewhere. Maybe the lines aren't as dense as they are perhaps in some of the countries that have had more continuous occupation. But not only occupation, but it's about awareness, as you pointed out. If we're talking about informational stuff here, then you've got to have somebody who's open to the informational world, and there are a lot of people in the Western world that are. I don't know enough about Eastern Europe to say, but the couple of times that I've been to Eastern Europe, in Russia, for example, yes, they've got some of the similar stuff to what we have. Whether it's in the same density, I don't know, but there's certainly an awareness there. But when Hamish first went to New Zealand, he found it hard to find the sort of things that we had in this part of the world. But you can argue that that's because he went as a sort of a white European, as it were, and perhaps wasn't a local. So maybe different people do pick up different things. But I think there's a huge amount out there to be found, and I think there's a huge amount out there to be found in places that you wouldn't necessarily consider. But that's partly because there aren't the people out there looking for it, or they have a different mindset. If you go back to the pre-BSD times, there weren't many people in Britain dowsing the sort of things that we do. Yes, there were water diviners. Yes, there were animal healers. There were people about doing this sort of non-physical stuff. But in terms of looking at the lines that perhaps some of which we've discussed tonight, then there weren't people doing it, and therefore there wasn't a lot being found. That doesn't mean to say it wasn't there.
Thank you, Nigel. I'm sorry for the impossible question, but I found the talk very, very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ken. And Maeve, over to you.
Oh, thank you, Nigel. That was really interesting as usual. I just wanted to throw something out there about the Hartmann and Curry lines, which I am nowhere near an expert on. In fact, I very rarely dowse them. But I think I was with you in 2015, Nigel, when Steve Dawson did that course. And then at a recent BSD conference, he did a workshop and he had us going out there. And I honestly can't remember if he had us dowsing for a Curry or a Hartmann line. Slap wrists. But as a lot of you know, I'm a vibrational deviceless dowser. So when I find a line like this, I like to literally get my hands on it. And I like to be able to feel with my hands the very center of the line and how high it is above ground level. And so that's what I did. And I can confirm that what I was dowsing, they definitely are in 3D. They're sort of like boxes. And I went home and I sort of dowsed a few round home just out of interest. But it occurred to me that if I've, say, got a Curry line going through my bedroom and a Hartmann line going through my bedroom, I might have got this wrong, but I think it's when the two clash that it causes a problem. But if they're in 3D, what might be happening is that the Hartmann line is going through at 6 inches above the floor level, but the Curry line's going through at 18 inches above the floor level, in which case they don't actually clash. So would they cause a problem? I just wanted to throw it out there. I don't know the answer. Just wondered what other people thought.
It's such a good comment. I think I'll put that in the next talk, actually. Honestly, it never occurred to me, but I hadn't considered putting that into the presentation, and yet you're probably so evidently right. You know, if that's from the point of view of people like ourselves looking at it, and you would understand that lines that are on the same, I'm going to have to call it wavelength. I don't like doing that, but on the same type of line, you would expect there to be some sort of interference pattern. But if you get a crossing point between, I don't know, a Benker line and a celestial grid line, you don't get an interference pattern because they're completely different things. And you might be right, spatially different as well. And I hadn't really considered that. So there we go. You set me off on yet another thing. I'll go out when the sun comes up. I'll go out and have a look at our friend up at Merivale and see if I can.
Yeah, get a ladder and see how high they are.
Ladder up at all.
Thank you, Maeve. Lovely.
Yeah.
Yes, Nigel, I've got a question about, I was really interested in you sharing the Wessex astrum and then Maeve's pentagrams. And I've recently been watching Maeve's videos that are on the BSD YouTube channel.
Very good.
And they're really excellent. Yes, and just like you were saying in the presentation about the joining up of all these different sacred sites or major oak trees, and then the connection that we all have. And my question is, I see pentagrams and sort of the golden ratio everywhere. You know, we see it in nature everywhere, and we see it in the human body. You know, you have Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, he looks like a pentagram, and you know, you can look at the human face and see, you know, the shape of a pentagram in that, and just the same kind of proportions. When I'm looking at labyrinths, I can discern a labyrinth in the body, you know, on the hand, doing a hand labyrinth, or the ear, or, you know, or even the face, and you see labyrinths in the land. So you were kind of hinting at that, how much of it is our consciousness, but also how much is it of our interweaving of our existence walking the earth, and also the landscape we walk on and in. And so when I see these patterns, I can relate them to the, you know, the micro, the macro, the as within, so without. I do see the connection between these sacred sites and our, you know, proportions in the human frame. Have you found anything like that yourself? What does that seem like to you, that concept?
Well, so I think one can say without too much contradiction that sort of sacred geometry is an important and sort of embedded part of the matrix, certainly. I've never attempted to put the human side of sacred geometry on into the linear landscape, but that doesn't mean to say it couldn't be regarded in the same way. I tend to think that the sacred geometry again is something that's out there, but it's out there because we see it. Now, it works together perfectly well as a whole line of reality, a whole layer of reality. And certainly all those, Robin Heath and John Michell and others, have sort of shown it in spades to relate to the world. Doesn't mean to say that everybody else is going to find it or that it's relevant to them. So, on the one hand, I think, yes, this is the answer to everything. And then I think, well, it's the answer to everything for somebody. Yes. Other people look at it. I seem to have become a professional heretic here. It wasn't my choice, I can assure you, but I try to be honest.
Oh, thank you, Nigel. Yes, I mean, when I remember Michael Caine doing a talk about, and I think he's on our call this evening as well, just talking about Mary Caine, his mother's Glastonbury zodiac, and just seeing those patterns in the landscape and how they could relate to who we are and where we are in the cosmos. And you were saying about the planetary lines and also sensing stars or maybe constellation sort of lines coming through. Everything, of course, is connected. So it's just great to be curious about that connection. Then whichever way and whatever aspect of consciousness it takes you is an adventure of sorts, isn't it?
Indeed. And if you think about the constellations, which is a classic sort of touchstone, really, because the constellations exist from where we are here. If we were X number of light years over there, we wouldn't see them like that. They wouldn't exist in that format. That doesn't mean to say that the bodies are changed. It's us that would have changed. And the information field is there for us all to see. We choose from it what we wish.
Love that. Thank you, Nigel. John, you've got a question.
Yeah, thanks very much for the presentation. That was really good. And I think my question was, you talked about the energy layers in a line of consciousness, and obviously you've got them marked out differently. And I was curious that from your perspective, what are the differences between those two lines from a dowsing or other perception perspective? And I guess the reason I'm asking that is because I work with two other dowsers, and I sort of get really different results to the other two people, which I think that we've touched on why that might be, but I'm just curious, how what you perceive as those differences.
Well, I'm pleased to hear you say that, and the first thing is, of course, you're all right, but you're all right from your own perspective, as it were. The difference really is that the lines of consciousness are not Earth energy lines in the physical or pseudo-physical point of view, in my opinion, but that the Earth energy lines are, almost by definition, things that that contain or are closely associated with Earth energy, whatever that means. I think we could spend all night having just a zoom on what is Earth energy, or even does Earth energy exist? Yeah, and we could get very irate with one another, but we wouldn't be any further forward. My personal view is that you ask if you want to try to differentiate one from another, is merely to go to each line in turn and work it out. And that's exactly what I did with that diagram of the Merivale Menhir, is I just walked around it and I said, right, that's a line, what's that? I have the slight problem is that as I mentioned in the talk, I grew up, if that's the right phrase, certainly in a dowsing sense, thinking that these long straight lines that other people called lays were purely lines of consciousness. And it was only when I met Graham and we had our subsequent excursion to France that I realized that it wasn't as simple as that, and that some were indeed long straight energy lines. And I think we're still quite we don't really understand why we've got long straight energy lines. It's almost a contradiction in terms, but that does depend on what you mean by earth energy. And glossary of terms is is so important in all this, and it is why I got into this. As I was trying to work out what it was that people were talking about and why it wasn't that for me. And I sort of started, I think, to find sort of some answers to some of those questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Stu, you've got your hand raised.
I have indeed. Thank you. Hello, Nigel. Thank you for a wonderful and very comprehensive description of all the different types of lines that we are absolutely astounded by. And it seems to me that it's big on the idea of interconnectivity. I get the feeling that once we think it exists to an extent, that we are noticing an interconnectivity and joining dots. And thus, I think to an extent that we do create a line or can sense a line. My particular question about it was relating to something cosmological. It's the ideas of planetary lines. You mentioned that, and I've done it myself. I've dowsed this site and I've found, for instance, a Jupiter line or some other, shall we say, outer world influence, a line. Is this frozen in time, this line? Because, of course, as we all know, we're spinning around through this cosmos and the planets are spinning around us. So surely those lines are there for that moment in time, but perhaps when we go back, theoretically, unless we still think they're there, then they wouldn't be there.
It's a very good point. You make several points in there, very, very, very wisely, really. Excuse me. Firstly, when we talk about thinking things into existence, it's a bit like people saying, "Oh, but that's an imaginary thing. It's just your imagination." Well, it is. You're just your imagination. But as Tom Graves will tell you, your imagination is a fact. It might only be a fact for you, but it's something that exists in reality. And if you've got an awareness that's sharp enough or open enough to look for that particular thing for whatever reason, then you can find it too, because somebody else has brought it out of the field. And I think it's not that we make it up, it's more that we choose different types of information, and having chosen it, then other people can find it. And I'm going to go right off the wall here, and I haven't thought this through at all. I'm just going to say that if somebody came up with a load of grids which were related to certain animals, I bet they could go out and find the cat grid and the dog grid and the bear grid and the whatever. And I've probably just invented that, and somebody will go out and do it now. But if they do, then that is very reinforcing of the fact that it's easy to invent this stuff and quite dangerous to do so. So I'm always aware that people are very good at sort of unearthing things. They're not terribly good at sort of interpreting them or indeed putting them back. You can't put them back entirely. But once you've opened the box is open. This really is sort of Pandora all over. And I think to some extent that's what we're doing. And the danger is we end up with so much stuff, so many lines, so many alignments, so many ideas that cope with it, and it starts to become a bit meaningless. And maybe I'm getting to that stage of saying, well, where's the next lot coming from? But in truth, these things are out there for people like us to find, and other people can find them as well.
Yeah, thank you, Nigel. Yeah, very much so. And I do think that the whole thing is very, very complex. We're investigating an information field, and I think that is a huge subject. That it's 99% of us is plasma, which is energy. So I don't think we'll ever get to the bottom of it, but it's fun investigating it.
Not this time, anyway. Thanks.
Thank you,
Thank
Nigel.
you, Stu. And David, you ready for your
Hello.
question?
Yes, thank you, Nigel. There's so many things to argue with there. I'm not really quite sure where to start, but I will try to refrain. Yeah, we ought to have another session when we just discuss what the energy lines are. But I would like to defend Billy Gorn a little bit. Because you kind of painted him as someone who was uninfluenceable or so set in his ways that you weren't going to get a word in edgeways. I did a workshop with him and we had a great time because he uses a peripheral vision type of dowsing, and I do a similar visual, well, not similar, but a visual type of dowsing, and I found him very receptive to what I had to say. He was very interesting as well. Kind of taught me some, but I actually managed to teach him a little bit of what I could see. So defending him a little bit there. You've not really mentioned what the energy lines I find are. I mean, I'm talking about water lines. Yeah. But then you get a negative ion running along the ground above the water line. So there's kind of two aspects to a water line. Magnetic lines, and then the sound lines. Right? So the earth has a sound and sound has a structure. And a lot of these sacred sites are built for the harmonic resonance. So to kind of just completely leave those out, I think is leaving out a huge side of the whole Earth energies aspect. I've never found a Hartmann and Curry grid. I've worked with people who were telling me what they were, and when I've looked, it's been a water line and a sound line interacting or something like that. So I'm yet to find them. But you're saying that everybody can find an energy. When you go to these sites, you don't have to go to a sacred site. You can just find them running across your garden or through your house or in the field down the road or across the cricket pitch. They're there. It's then down to interpretation. And so many of these books have rather, from my point of view, rather odd interpretations of what these energy lines are. That's, I think, where we all come into conflict. I will interpret a line. Well, I don't need to interpret it quite so much because I can see them. Right. So my opinion upon them is based on what I can see. But then if you're just going in with a rod and you're twitching, you're kind of stuck with an interpretation which might come from anywhere. And although we're finding the same lines quite often, one person's interpretation of what we're both finding would be very different to mine because it's come from a very different source. But anyway, yes. Well, thank you.
Yeah,
Lovely stirring talk there.
I had my eye on you up all through there because I knew there would be certain things there that you would balk at, and that's because you're a different sort of dowser, and in a sense you're proving the point, I'm very pleased to hear you say that. But Billy is my mentor and my guide. I merely try to point out that he's somebody that I've never managed to influence, but so if you have, then all credit to you. Yeah, that's something that you could do.
Yeah,
David,
no,
thanks.
we had a wonderful session there.
Great man. And a lot of people have tried to get me to talk him into doing a session or going to see him or whatever. He did open up to our friends from Paris, and they went to see him, and they had a lovely afternoon with him. But that was the only time I've been able to persuade him to do anything in recent years. No, he has an approach and a mind and a philosophy that has determined the earth energy dowsing. He formed the earth energy dowsing group, so he is the he for those that don't know, in 1995, after decades of earth energy has been regarded as a bit of sort of nonsense, something you had to put up with, Billy Gorn finally managed to persuade the British Society of Dowsers trustees to allow him to put a piece of paper and a pencil at the door of the room that they were having their conference, with a view to anybody who's interested in earth energies, please sign this, put your name and address, didn't have emails in those days, name and address on this piece of paper. And Billy collected them up and wrote to them, and there were 20 of them. Within 5 years, maybe 10, 2/3 of the BSD were earth energy dowsers, and today it's hard to find a dowser who doesn't have some connection with earth energy, and that's almost exclusively down to Billy and his work. And I think he's beyond comparison. So I certainly don't wish to degrade him. Anyway, jolly good. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Saoirse, ready to ask your question?
Hi there. Thank you. Thank you, Nigel. That was great. I'm sniffly, sorry. I'm calling in from British Columbia, Canada. Was on the island where Susan and somebody else mentioned. And so there's a couple things I wanted to bring up. I'm very new, brand new, actually, you could say. And interestingly, when I was on Hornby Island, because I was living there for a while, which is a very, very magical place if you've ever heard of it. And I know that there was somebody who's passed away now, but he was there's a website actually. If you put Hornby Island ley lines, it might still be up, and how the ley lines connect from Hornby to Machu Picchu and Glastonbury. But anyhow, while I was there, I met a very interesting fellow, total water witcher. He lives very close to the land. He's ancient himself, and he did a workshop, and so got the old willow wand out there, and he had his dowsing rods and stuff too. So one of my questions is, and it was fun, it worked for me, but he plumbed, right? He was plumbing to show how deep the wells are, or water is, for wells. And I was thinking, well, and I struggled to plumb, right? He was just boom, boom, boom. He's like, oh, that's that many feet right off the bat. So I was thinking, can you do that when you're, trying to discover these 3D forms that I don't remember the names because I'm very new, that you were saying these structures, these boxes or whatever.
You certainly Sorry, yeah, you certainly can. I would say that the people who do things very quickly and very accurately, if that matter, are just very experienced. And I think there are loads of people on this call who are very, very experienced and in their own ways could do that with certain aspects. Most people do have a specialization there. But at the end of the day, it is just practice. Billy Gorn will tell you it's just practice. You can all do it. And when you're with Billy, he'll get you deviceless dowsing. Get you doing things that you think are way outside your capability. But when you're back on your It's not quite so easy, but it is about practice. And Billy will always tell you the story that when he got into dowsing, he was a farmer and he spent most of his life as a farmer in Northern Ireland. And he used to be out in his tractor ploughing the fields day after day. And for a man with his intelligence and insight, quite frankly, he was bored senseless. And he actually taught himself to douse as being something he could do while he was sat at the tractor wheel. And he could tell when the energy lines were coming out. He could tell when the water lines were coming up. And in the end, he didn't need anything to do it. He could just see it. And he'd just look out and say, oh, yeah, there's a water line. Oh, there's another one. And but it
That,
was
that
really
Oh, sorry.
practice.
Yeah, yeah, and I totally get that. That brings me to something else I was going to mention. So I was wondering too, like, can we plumb for like these boxes? Is that possible? But also, um, wanted to know if anybody's heard of John Young. He's a known animal. He's a tracker. He wrote about bird language. He spent time in the Kalahari, and really getting into it. And he could when he learned in the Kalahari um, to say he was tracking a lion, not to go and shoot it, but he's tracking animals, putting an intention out there, knows there's an animal out there, and he started finally getting to the point where he could see a blue line, a blue energetic line on the ground leading straight to it. And the men in the Kalahari, like that came to meet him when he landed in the Kalahari, there was no communication. There's no way they could know where he was going to land at the Kalahari. Is a big place. And they parked, they got all their equipment out, and this guy walks out of the bush and he said, how did you know I was coming? And he's like, come on, pack up, we're gonna go. They have a translator and go back to the camp, which was 4 days walk. So the guy knew 4 days before to start walking to him. And he would just go straight, like he would just go straight, knowing straight where to go. So yeah, I guess fascinating that there are people here too that have joined today who can also do that without even. So just going to mention that John Young is his name. And what was the other thing? I think that was. Oh, right. And then somebody also mentioned about geometry in the face. We were talking about geometry and everything. I just learned about Jason Paget, and he's acquired savant syndrome. He got pretty beat up when he was younger, and he woke up. He sees everything. He sees the geometry and everything in our faces, in the land. He sees all how it's mathematical. So I just thought I'd mention him. I'll put it in the message box if anybody's interested. But yeah, that's I don't know if that was a question, just things I wanted to mention. It was more like, well, if you're going to be trying to find a box around a structure, how could you do it if you didn't have like a 30-foot ladder, right? So
Thank you. Thank you
There
so
are
much.
various
Yeah.
there are various ways of doing it. I don't think we've got time to do it in great detail. In fact, interestingly enough, if tracking, certainly I would suggest most people on this call would be able to track where somebody has been. And it was certainly something that Alan Neil taught me right back at the start of my dowsing. It was probably a bit premature, but certainly just setting a date in time and saying, well, where was so and so at this particular time? And sort of walking to a water supply and where the water supply used to be and that sort of thing. It's fascinating. Some people get a bit spooked because you are literally getting into the footsteps of people who've been there before, and you're just a little bit out of time. But by and large, it's not actually that difficult with practice. So there we go. Thank you, Sorsha.
Yeah, and
thank you.
Sorsha, if you check the chat, Brenda, who is the editor for the Canadian Society of Questers, has messaged you because there's going to be a field trip to Vancouver Island, maybe May. So if you check the messages and find out how to contact Brenda, you might be able to sync up. So thank you,
Thanks,
Brenda.
Anna.
Okay, and Douglas. Mr. Gordon, are you with us? You've got your hand up.
I forgot about unmuting. The greetings from Ireland.
Excellent.
I've been tracking a number of lines that cross Ireland from the southeast to the northwest. And Michael Poinder had found these lines previously. So I went out to check them out, and I found at Tara a line that was about 40 foot wide, but it was a combination of water, magnetic, water, magnetic, water, magnetic. And then I've checked that out also up in Sligo, the same line, and Carramore, which is a megalithic cemetery. And I found the same line about the same width, and again repeated water magnetic, water magnetic. And then just to the west of that, you have the hill of Knocknaree with Queen Maeve's grave on it. And the path leading up to that megalithic tomb is the actual energy line itself. Most people don't realize it, that they're walking on it, but it goes straight into the cairn and then out the other side. And I'm now starting to look for other similar lines across the country. And I was wondering whether you have any comment on those kind of lines.
Oh gosh. Firstly, I'm delighted to hear that you're finding them in Ireland as well, because you do tend to get sort of personal centric to these things, and not everything starts on Dartmoor. There are other places in the world, and but I'm sure I've got no reason to assume those lines don't exist. I'm quite interested in your picking up different threads in them, different strands in them, because we've tonight concentrated effectively on earth energy and lines of consciousness, whereas sorts of other stuff around, and there are people, as you will know, who believe that the whole universe is electric, and it's just all about electricity, and whilst that's not particularly my view, different people see it in different ways, and I think it's very important that different people from different parts of the country, different parts of countries and around the world do look at their own stuff in their own way, and it's great to come to a forum like this where you can share that information, and I would certainly be very welcome to receive any information that you've got on these lines and your approach to them. I think that's really interesting.
We have further south from Sligo a place called Rathcrohan or Tulsk, and that's the western equivalent of Tara. And I've noticed by doing some field work, there's some standing stones, but there's also some flat stones, maybe with a little gap. And there is an outpouring of energy from these stones on one side, but not on the other. And these are literally flat stones, you just walk across the top of them. But the direction of flow is towards the maybe about a mile away, where the main Rath would be for the Rathcrohan complex, where the main round fort would be. And it's just interesting to see how it's a bit like how can I put it, an electronic motherboard, and how the energy is guided. So I found that fascinating. I'd love to talk to the people who put it all together.
Well, wouldn't we all? Yes. Maybe one day we will. Who am I to say? Thanks very much.
Nigel, can I just...
Thanks.
There's a message in the chat that's from Brenda in Canada saying, Douglas, are they bunches of lines side by side, or are they a candy cane with the magnetic and water line entwined? Douglas?
I haven't gone into that kind of detail, but I would say that there's maybe a 1 foot wide water line followed by a 1 foot wide magnetic line.
Okay.
And they go on repeating for 40 feet. Does that answer the question?
I'll ask Brenda by email. She's going to speak.
All right, okay.
She hasn't got a screen. Thank you, Douglas. Sorry to interrupt.
Right.
Thank you. We've also had a question in the chat from Harry about energy lines that are not so detrimental. Nigel, you were talking about the one near Merivale, the one that, and you were talking about the sort of scarring in the landscape. And is there any pointer that you can provide for where's good to read up on this, perhaps? I've pointed Harry to Graham's very kindly shared the glossary of terms, because that's quite a good thing to sort of have a checklist for with a description. Is there any other book or any other material that might be beneficial to check and understand out a bit?
We'll talk about detrimental lines. My concern is, well, my view is that they're detrimental to certain people and certain species and certain things, and not to others. Maybe I'm just a bit wooden in all this, but I find a lot of the detrimental stuff to be, well, it's just not very pleasant, you know, but you wouldn't make a big fuss about it. But of course, a lot of it depends on whether you're physically or psychically or spiritually entwined with that particular place. You know, if you're sleeping on it or you're sitting on it for any length of time. I certainly had a line under my desk at work at one point, which I certainly realized wasn't doing me any good. You know, you could just say it was just bad EMFs in the building, but in fact, I got permission to move my desk, and I found that was beneficial. So, well, maybe I've just psyched myself into better health. I don't know, but it does. I think it does depend. I don't know that I could really recommend a work on it, because it sort of feeds into a lot of other people's research, and lots of people do have a view on the fact that there's lots of detriment about. And in fact, I'd be even more cynical now and say a lot of people have a commercial idea that to find lots of detriment that they can then remediate, if that's the right phrase. But
one thing I've noticed by being out and about really is that some areas just feel like a kind of uplifting kind of sense of kind of positive vibe, if you want, and other places don't. And I realize there's obviously, you know, history of events and terrible things that might have happened in certain places, but it also feels that there's something different as well, that it isn't necessarily just a human thing, that there's a kind of a resonance somewhere that is kind of special. And I just wondered how you would kind of check on using dowsing to kind of explore what kind of things were bringing more positive or less positive kind of things to the situation, or to yourself, really.
I think tonight
if that makes sense.
What we've done is look at long straight lines and nothing else. And I've been very specific about that, otherwise we really could talk all night. But if you work your way through what makes something benevolent or what makes it detrimental, or indeed your feelings towards it, that's basically what house healers and that do, is they work through often a physical checklist of things that may or may not make something feel benign to you, or something that's doing you some harm. All you can do is work your way through it. There's so much there to be worked through. And I would say that everybody who does house healing has a speciality, and they start with something and they work forward. In the houses that I've worked with, people have, and I don't advertise myself as a house healer. I don't claim any great shakes in that, but people have heard of me and they say, do come and have a look. And so I say, well, I'm happy to look at it, and I will work my way through. Most people think they've either been zapped by 5G or that they've got a ley line in their house. 99% of them, I think, have just got a water line, which isn't doing them a lot of good. Sometimes there are also spiritual stuff around, but it's not my sort of field of activity. But nonetheless, I can certainly ask. Are you under psychic attack from something in this house? And if I get a yes, well, I know to phone up somebody on this call, quite frankly, and send them round. And so it's horses for courses.
They just kind of work it through in your own way, kind of thing, and just ask questions like, "Why do I feel this is doing this to me?" And that
not
kind of
actually
thing.
but it does require a degree of organized approach, let's put it that way. So but you learn to go along, and other people will help you. So if you if you want to sort of get some advice, find a local dowser with a lot of experience, and they'll certainly give you an idea of what they do. And within a few months, you'll be doing it yourself, and you'll be doing it in a different way. But always be humble, always be careful, always bear in mind that it's you that's doing it. And you're the one that's opening up the channel to the information field around you, and you're letting all sorts of stuff in. Be careful.
Right. Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you, Nigel. Now, Maeve, I think I saw your hand up and then I saw you disappear. Have you still got a question? A second question?
I can say something if we've got time. Yeah, I was just going to mention the landscape pentagrams. The ones that I found quite a few of them. The 5-sided, drawn on the ground, and for years I've been trying to figure out how they work in 3D, and I think I actually sussed it a few months ago, because if you take the 5 sides and leave the 5 tips, leave them on the ground, but take the dead center and raise it up, then you've got 5 straight lines going from each of the tips to the center, and what you've got is the top of a icosahedron. And this is one of the platonic solids which has got 20 faces that are all equilateral triangles. And if that's what it is, what we've got above ground, the landscape pentagram is literally just showing the top maybe quarter of this geometric shape. And I also found out yesterday, actually, that the icosahedron is a platonic dual of the dodecahedron, which has got 12 faces that are all pentagonal. So it could be that these particular landscape geometries are something to do with some sort of 3D geometry that surrounds the planet. But I don't know. I've only something I've figured out recently, so I just thought I'd throw it in there.
You'll find those in cymatics.
Interesting.
Right.
Thank you, Maeve. Really appreciate you sharing that. And Cow Whisperer Paul, you've got a question?
Great talk. Very swift question, and the answer is no. I'm fired up by your Hartmann, Curry lines, and Benker grids stuff, and I've been doing ChatGPT while you've been talking, and apparently there are such things as nodes between Hartmann, Benker, and Curry lines. And according to tradition, I've been trying to check this, but it comes from a Bavarian tradition. These nodes are called dragon's teeth or draken, whatever it is. And apparently they're very, very rare. Have you ever come across one of these things, Nigel? Or has anybody else here come across these things? A combination of all those lines together, because apparently it is a weird phenomena.
I've never come across it because I've never looked for it, and I didn't even know it existed. So thank you, Paul. That's something else for me to do on a dull day. But there's no intrinsic reason why it shouldn't exist, and I think even if it hadn't existed previously, you've now brought it into existence, so we can all go and look for it.
You may be right about this bringing into existence thing, but when I read this thing, it was saying that these are incredibly rare. And so I got the AI to draw a picture for me of what one of these nodes might look like. And it looked like nothing that you would have expected it to be. Until I then asked a supplementary question, do Hartmann, Benker and Curry lines move? Okay. And yes, they do according to different cycles of sun, moon, and all that sort of stuff. But statistically, given the number of these lines that are flowing around the planet, there must be lots and lots of these dragon teeth. However, they can't be rare unless a strange phenomenon is happening around them. But do you have a comment on this before I hand off to somebody else?
Well, I think we could open the thing for the rest of the night. No, I don't have a direct comment on that. What I would say is that the other day I actually did a talk on AI and dowsing, AI and spirituality, sorry. And I just think you're starting to open a door there to something that's a little bit wider than what we're doing tonight. So I hear what you say, Paul. It's easy to open doors. It's not so easy to understand what comes through them at times.
Thanks for that. Next question.
Thank you, Paul. And Jeff, you got your hand raised.
Yeah, good evening, everybody. Very quick one. Are you familiar with, I'm looking for my picture actually, can anyone see it? Oh, here we go. Science of Magic by Dean Radin, just come out, very new.
I just read that, Jeff. It's brilliant.
Good. Draw your attention to chapter 6 about some of the things you'll be talking about tonight. Here in this 19th lesson.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.
I just read that book, Jeff. It's really interesting. Dean Radin's amazing.
Lovely stuff. And I think we've asked all of our questions, and Nigel, you've been most gracious with all of your answers. Thank you very much. And we're about to wrap up and come to a close. So can I invite the lovely Ali to help close our session? Thank you.
Thank you. Kindly luminous beings, guardians of this Zoom space, we all leave in love and peace, and thank you for your hospitality, blessings, love, and all your protections whilst we were in this Zoom space. And so let it be.